I went camping with my friends, Nate, Oliver, and Mark, the summer after we finished high school. We had been close friends throughout most of our school years. Our other friend, Josh, couldn't join us because he had started college the previous year and was still away. We had all been camping before, but not in this specific location. We were warned to be cautious of bears, but we weren't too worried since we all knew bear safety well. Nate even brought along his rifle just in case. We had heard from one of our teachers that the campsite we picked was stunning and tranquil, with a beautiful lake and plenty of hiking paths. Excited, we drove to the site and then hiked in for about 3 hours since there was no car access. The hike wasn't tough. You could probably manage it on a four-wheeler if you had good skills. But we didn't have one, so we hiked. We carried our tents, sleeping bags, and supplies on our backs. The trail was picturesque, and we joked and chatted all the way. The sun was shining brightly, and the birds were chirping happily. We spotted some bear droppings, but it didn't bother us. In fact, we were eager to see a bear. When we reached our campsite with plenty of daylight left, we were amazed by its beauty. We found a nice spot by the lake and set up our tents among the trees, which provided plenty of shade. The water was crystal clear, and we could see fish occasionally leaping. After gathering some firewood, we built a fire. Feeling adventurous, I decided to explore the area, and Mark joined me. We hiked for a few hours, soaking in the stunning scenery. As we walked, we found more signs of bears, including scratch marks on trees and large piles of droppings. We began to feel a bit uneasy but reassured ourselves that we'd be fine as long as we didn't do anything foolish. Upon returning to our campsite, we sat around the fire, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. By then, Nate and Oliver had hoisted what remained of our food high in a tree to keep it away from any bears. That's really the minimum you need to do in such situations. We stayed up, lounging around the fire. It was a perfect night so far. We eventually went to bed around 3 a.m. I fell asleep the moment I lay down. Suddenly, I was jolted awake by the sound of screaming. Confused and disoriented, I sat up in my tent, which was still dim as if the sun was just beginning to rise. Checking my phone, I saw that it was 5:20 a.m. I heard loud growling noises and peeked out of my tent to see a massive bear tearing apart Oliver's tent. Oliver was screaming and trying to escape. I was frozen in fear, unsure of what to do. I got out of my tent and stood there, wanting to help my friend but knowing I couldn't. Then, Nate sprang up, grabbed his rifle, and fired a warning shot into the air, causing the bear to vanish. The sound of the gunshot was deafening, and my ears rang. I looked at Nate, who still held his rifle. He looked pale and shaken. In that moment, we realized we needed to leave the campsite immediately. We packed up our gear and hurried down the trail, with Nate clutching the rifle the entire way. We were too frightened to remain in the area, even though we had planned to stay for 3 more nights. We hiked back to our car as quickly as we could, not wanting to look back or think about what could have happened if Nate hadn't scared the bear away. Once we reached our car, we drove to the nearest ranger station and reported the bear encounter. The ranger told us we were fortunate to have escaped and reminded us to always be cautious when camping in bear territory. We drove to a nearby town and found an inexpensive motel for the night. We spent hours discussing the incident and how lucky we were to be alive. Nate emerged looking like a hero, and honestly, he deserved it. This took place a few summers back during a camping trip I went on with my close friends, Jake, Leo, and Sam. Leo knew about a secluded area deep in the woods that his uncle had shown him. Both he and Sam were seasoned outdoorsmen, but Jake and I were less experienced. It was several hours away from our town, and we made the trip in Leo's dad's old SUV. The drive was full of winding roads and steep inclines, and by the time we arrived, the place's beauty hit me hard. From where we parked, it was at least a 2-hour hike to the camping spot. We didn't see another person for miles, and it felt like we were completely on our own out there. The site was surrounded by thick woods, and a narrow stream flowed nearby. We set up our tents and spent the rest of the afternoon exploring. Although it wasn't a formal campsite, the area was somewhat established, with a fire pit already there. When night settled in, we built a fire and relaxed, cooking dinner and sharing a few beers we'd brought along. We'd only managed to carry in 1 6-pack, so that's all we had. Conversation flowed smoothly, and we were all in high spirits. We finally turned in around 1 a.m. and each crawled into our individual tents, which we'd set up side by side on the only flat patch of ground available. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night, somewhere around 3:30 a.m., to a sound of movement in the bushes. At first, I assumed it was an animal, but as I listened, the footsteps sounded human. Frozen in place, I lay there listening to the faint sounds, uncertain what to do. Eventually, I drifted back to sleep and woke up at dawn. I didn't mention what I'd heard to the others, partly because I wasn't sure if I dreamed it. We spent the day hiking and had a pretty good time, but when we returned to the site, we noticed something strange. Jake's lighter and a small knife were missing. He'd left them by the fire pit, and we all looked at each other, puzzled. Who could have taken them? We hadn't seen a single person since we arrived. As the sun began to set, a sense of unease settled over me. I felt like we were being watched, but I kept it to myself. I didn't want to make the others nervous. We went to bed again around midnight, and like the night before, I woke up around 3. This time it was because I needed to step outside. As I looked up at the sky, the full moon was so bright I could see well into the woods. That's when I noticed a figure, a man walking slowly in the distance. He moved with an odd, dragging step, and his clothes were torn and he was barefoot. I wanted to hide, but there wasn't anywhere to go. He turned his head and our eyes met. The look he gave me sent a chill down my spine. He even smiled, but it was far from comforting. It didn't make sense that someone would be out here so isolated and in that condition. I hurried back to the tents and woke the others to tell them what I'd seen. They were all uneasy but agreed we should wait until morning to leave. We huddled around the fire, talking in low voices. Every rustle in the bushes had us on edge. The footsteps returned a few times through the night, though we never saw the man again. When the morning finally arrived, we all agreed it was best to pack up and head out. Even though we had planned to stay one more day, none of us felt comfortable. The 3-hour hike back was tense, and hardly anyone spoke. Relief washed over us once we reached the SUV, feeling safe at last. We never found out who that man was, but Jake never got his knife or lighter back, which left us unsettled. Knowing that the stranger had taken them made us realize he was probably watching us all along. Later, when Leo shared the story with his uncle, he was just as surprised. He'd camped at that spot countless times and had never seen anyone else out there. It left us with a mystery we still can't explain. Nearly 2 decades ago, I was eager for a camping trip I'd planned with friends. My buddies, Rachel, Mike, Tyler, and I needed a break from the city, so we packed up and headed to a secluded state park in southern Michigan. We were excited about being surrounded by nature for a few days. With our gear packed and the car loaded, we hit the road, ready for adventure. Our destination was a large park known for its thick, green woods. When we arrived, we parked near the visitor center and began our trek into the forest. The trail wasn't long, but the path was rough, and the dense trees blocked most of the afternoon sunlight, making it feel later than it was. Hiking here would be nearly impossible in the dark, even with flashlights. After a couple of hours, we found a good camping spot beside a serene lake. We built a campfire, cooked some food, and swapped stories as the sky filled with stars. It was a picture-perfect night to kick off our trip. The following day, we explored nearby trails and found another beautiful lake, where we spent the afternoon swimming in the refreshing water. We made it back to our campsite by evening, prepared dinner, and enjoyed another night under the stars. But that night took a strange turn. As we sat around the campfire, we noticed a light across the lake. We hadn't seen anyone else around, so the glow surprised us. It looked like another campfire on the opposite shore. Our curiosity got the better of us, and we decided to take a closer look. We grabbed our flashlights and headed down toward the lake. As we got closer, we realized the light was indeed from a campfire across the water. Relieved to think it was just another group of campers, we turned back toward our fire. But just then, something in the water caught our attention, freezing us in place. A body was drifting toward the shore. In the faint light, we could see it was a woman, her eyes staring lifelessly up at the sky. We were all terrified. Tyler was shaking as he whispered, "We should pull her out." Rachel, ever the practical one, hissed, "No way, don't touch her. It'll mess up any evidence." "Haven't you seen a crime show?" Tyler backed off, realizing we all agreed with Rachel. But we were stuck. Without cell service, we couldn't call for help, and we couldn't hike out safely at night. The thought that this might be a murder sent a chill through us. If so, was the person responsible still nearby? At that thought, I quickly put out our fire, covering the coals with dirt to avoid detection. Glancing across the lake, I saw that the other campfire had vanished. Whoever was over there had extinguished it, too. We spent a sleepless night, taking turns keeping watch. Every rustle and shadow had us on edge. In the morning light, the reality hit harder. Seeing the body in daylight was surreal, far worse than in the dark. It was as if the night before had been a bad dream, but the sun made it real. Without wasting time, we hiked back to the nearest ranger station to report what we'd seen. The police came, combing the lake, and found the body, a young woman who had been missing for days. They questioned us all, piecing together any details that might help, but nothing added up. No one had seen or heard anything that pointed to the person responsible. We told them about the campfire across the lake, but park records showed no one else was registered in that area. We were certain we'd seen others, but the authorities couldn't track anyone down. As time passed, the case went unsolved, and they never found the person responsible. The experience stuck with us, and over time, our once-close group slowly drifted apart. Even now, I think back to that night. The woman's blank gaze into the sky haunts me. I wonder who could have done such a terrible thing, and if they're still out there, lurking in the shadows, waiting for someone else to wander into the wrong place at the wrong time. When I was about 11 or 12, my best buddy, Sam, would spend a couple of weeks at summer camp every year. That stretch was always the dullest part of my summer, since we usually spent most of our vacation days together. After a lot of pleading, I finally convinced my parents to let me join Sam at camp one year. Money was pretty tight at home, so it wasn't an easy ask, but they eventually agreed, thinking it would be good for me. We headed out on a bright Saturday morning, with Sam's parents giving me a ride since they were taking him up to camp anyway. I was beyond excited, eager to see all the things Sam had described over the years. Still, I was also a bit anxious since I'd never really been far from home for more than a night. As we pulled up, I saw several log cabins scattered in a clearing surrounded by towering trees, with one big cabin that looked like the main lodge where the camp director worked. It was the kind of scene you'd see on a postcard, complete with babbling brooks and crisp, clean air. We were really in the wilderness. When we arrived, a few counselors greeted us. They seemed friendly and weren't that much older than us, maybe 16 or 17. It did feel a bit risky leaving a bunch of kids in the middle of nowhere, But kids had been going to camps like this for generations, so a little independence didn't seem like a bad thing. The first few days were a whirlwind of getting settled, playing games, swimming, and canoeing on the nearby lake. Typical camp stuff. I started feeling more comfortable and my initial worries faded. After our first week, the counselors announced a 2-night hiking trip. We'd be sleeping out under the stars and putting our camp skills to the test. As we hiked deeper into the forest, they entertained us with tales from past camps, including an old legend. Supposedly, there used to be a prison nearby, and years ago, a convict escaped from there. One counselor told us this man was deeply disturbed. He had even lost a hand while trying to climb over a barbed wire fence, replacing it with a wooden prosthetic. After escaping, he hid in these woods, but was never caught. Though no one had seen him for ages, some claim to have spotted him recently. Of course, by now, he'd be in his 90s if he were still alive, surviving in the wild on bugs and roots. I didn't really buy the story, thinking it was just something the counselors made up to scare us. But Sam seemed to believe it a bit, even though we both agreed it was unlikely anyone was out there. That night, we set up camp and everyone quickly fell asleep, except Sam and me. Just as I lay down, Sam leaned over and whispered, "Hey, get up. I saw something back there." It looked like an old shack in the woods. Reluctantly, I got out of my sleeping bag and followed him. Our flashlights barely pierced through the thick brush as we made our way through fallen branches and underbrush. The counselor's story played on my mind, making me a bit uneasy. Finally, we reached a small clearing, and there it was, a worn-down shack standing in the moonlight. We looked at each other with a mix of excitement and curiosity. The place looked abandoned, so we didn't worry much about trespassing. The windows were shattered, the door was hanging by a hinge, and the roof had a huge hole in it. Inside, the shack was a wreck, which wasn't surprising. But what really got us were the carvings on the walls, strange symbols and eerie drawings that looked like some kind of ritual had taken place there. While creepy, it didn't feel dangerous, so we kept exploring. Sam moved to check another room while I examined the symbols. Suddenly, I heard him whisper, "Come here." His face was pale as I approached, and when I looked where he was pointing, I felt a chill. There, in the middle of the floor, was a wooden hand. That was enough for us. We bolted out of the shack and didn't stop running until we were back at our camp. Crawling into our sleeping bags, we lay awake until dawn, too shaken to sleep. We never told anyone about what we saw. Part of me thinks it was all just an elaborate prank, set up by the counselors to scare curious campers. But then again, it seemed too complex and too isolated for that. Whatever the truth, I can't shake the feeling that we stumbled upon something truly unsettling that night, and I don't think I'll ever forget it. I went on a camping trip with my cousins Brian and Marissa. Growing up, our families used to go every year, but now that we're older, it had been a while since our last trip. We decided to explore a remote national park close to where we lived, known for its wild, rugged landscape. The hike was a long, exhausting 3 hours, but as we pushed further into the forest, we didn't come across a single person. We set up camp just as the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon. Sitting around the campfire, we roasted marshmallows and swapped stories. The only sounds were the crackling flames and an occasional owl hooting. It felt incredibly peaceful and calming, a nice escape from the stresses of everyday life. But that calm didn't last. Suddenly, we heard a loud noise in the distance. It sounded like someone hitting a tree with a heavy stick. We all froze, exchanging worried glances. "Did you hear that?" Brian asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Maybe it's a bear," I suggested. After some hushed discussion, I decided to go check it out. I had more experience in the outdoors. I'd worked as a camp guide and had taken a few wilderness safety courses. I grabbed the brightest flashlight and cautiously headed toward the sound. I kept the light off for a bit since the moonlight was bright enough, hoping to confirm it was an animal before scaring it off. As I moved closer, my heart pounded. I saw a shadowy figure standing in the woods. It was hard to make out, but it looked like a man, his back turned to me. I quickly ducked behind a tree, staying hidden in case he turned around. After what felt like forever, the figure slipped away into the trees. I hurried back to our campsite, my heart still racing. "There's someone out there," I told them, my voice shaking. "I saw a man in the woods. He didn't see me, but he was definitely there." We all exchanged nervous glances, a mix of fear and confusion on our faces. "What's going on?" Marissa asked quietly. We decided to call it a night, but I couldn't sleep. Lying in my sleeping bag, I listened intently to the sounds around us. All night, I heard faint footsteps moving around our campsite. I stayed still, too frightened to move or see what was out there. I tried to convince myself it was my imagination, but it felt too real. Eventually, dawn broke, and I felt a wave of relief. I peeked out of my tent and walked around the campsite. Right away, we noticed signs that someone had been there during the night. Although nothing was missing, there were fresh cigarette butts scattered around, and none of us smoked. Even more unsettling, there was a small burn hole in the fabric of one of my cousin's tents, which hadn't been there before. We packed up quickly, nerves frayed as we trekked back through the woods, feeling as if unseen eyes were watching us. When we reported the incident back at the ranger station, they shrugged it off, suggesting it was just some passing hikers. But I knew what I saw, and deep down, I was certain we'd stumbled into something eerie in those woods. Photography has always been a passion of mine. I'd always dreamed of doing it full-time, and a few years back, I finally took the plunge and left my regular job. The start was nerve-wracking. I wasn't sure if I could make enough to cover my expenses. In the beginning, there were a few months where I barely made it, but in time, things began to improve and I've never looked back. One of my most profitable ventures has been capturing nature. Landscapes, animals, really anything unique that catches my eye. A few times each year, I go on a week-long trek in the wilderness, taking thousands of photos along the way. Out of all those shots, I usually end up with a few hundred that turn out amazing. I make my living by licensing these images to businesses, websites, and even for TV and movies. On one of these trips, something happened that I will never forget. I had planned a solo hike through the forests of Oregon. I'd heard about a spot there, known for having some of the most breathtaking views imaginable. Getting there was supposed to be extremely challenging. A 3-day hike each way through rugged terrain with no vehicle access at all. That was fine by me. I liked the idea of a difficult journey. If it were easy to reach, everyone would go, and my work wouldn't stand out as much. The scenery was stunning as I made my way in. Around every corner, there seemed to be another postcard-worthy view. Rolling hills, waterfalls, and I even spotted a full-grown elk, the first I'd ever seen. As the sun dipped below the horizon, I stopped to set up camp. My first memory card was already packed with great shots, and the following days were equally productive. There was no noise other than the breeze through the trees and the occasional birdsong. I felt very much alone. Not many people ventured this far in, and there was something eerie about it. I realized that bringing a partner might have been wise, but I didn't know anyone willing to take a week off just to walk for days on end. One evening, as dusk was settling in, I had already set up camp and was wandering around, hoping to capture a few more good shots before nightfall. That's when I heard it, a sound like footsteps. First, I assumed it was a deer, but as I followed the noise, I started to doubt that. Deer move gently, carefully placing each hoof to stay quiet and avoid attracting predators. This sound was more like a steady, dragging walk, as if a person were moving and slightly scraping their feet with each step. The sound grew louder as I followed it until, through the thick bushes, I saw something that shocked and unsettled me. There was an older woman, probably in her late 60s, slowly walking through the forest. She wore a spotless, flowing white dress and high-heeled shoes. Her hair was styled as if she were going to a formal event, and her makeup was perfect for such an occasion. She had no backpack or supplies with her, just a small white purse that matched her dress, trailing behind her. I should have felt the urge to help her, but something about the situation seemed off. There was a calmness around her, as though she belonged exactly where she was. I know it sounds odd, but that was the feeling I had in that moment, a sense that this was her place. I stood there for several minutes, watching as she slowly vanished into the distance. A few more minutes passed, and the sound of her footsteps faded completely. With the last bit of daylight, I made my way back to my campsite. I ended up sitting by the fire all night, unable to sleep, poking at the embers and thinking about what I'd seen. Part of me half expected to see her again, but she never reappeared. By morning, I decided to start my hike back out. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of it all. There was no way she could have reached that remote spot without making the same 3-day hike I had, and to do it in high heels without any food or water seemed nearly impossible. I might never understand what I saw or why I didn't approach her. All I know is I really wish I'd taken a photo. A few years back, when I was around 23, I had an unsettling experience while camping. I live in a scenic area full of dense woods. I won't say exactly where, but imagine plenty of trees and rugged trails. Growing up, I'd often go camping in the wilderness surrounding my town. Being in scouts from a young age, I'd gotten pretty comfortable outdoors. Even though it had been a few years since high school, I still hung out with a couple of close friends from those days, Alex and Ben. We had a strong bond. Alex had been in scouts with me and shared my passion for nature, while Ben was more of a city person. He still loved coming along whenever we'd invite him for camping trips. So the three of us decided to go camping for a weekend near the end of summer, around early September. The weather was still warm enough that we didn't need much, just my old tent and some blankets. That Saturday, we packed up Alex's truck and set out without a specific destination in mind. I'd camped in the area countless times, so I was comfortable finding a spot along the way. Around 11 a.m., we stumbled upon a great campsite not far from the road, and with a little effort, we managed to drive the truck in over rocks and tree roots. Alex's truck had 4-wheel drive, so it handled the rough ground. Ben, who wasn't keen on sleeping outdoors, claimed the truck's back seat, while Alex and I took the tent. We spent a few hours setting up. I pitched the tent while Ben gathered firewood, and Alex impressed us by crafting a small table using logs and an old plywood board we found nearby. Once camp was ready, we decided to explore the area on foot. By about 2 or 3 p.m., we started hiking. Not much happened on our hike, though we did find a secluded lake with marshy edges that kept us from wading in. One strange thing, though, we spotted fresh footprints that didn't belong to any of us. It was surprising, given how remote the area was, but it was public land, so it wasn't out of the question that someone else might be nearby. But when we returned to our campsite, my heart sank. There, in the middle of Alex's table, was a large hunting knife with a wooden handle and a strip of yellow tape around it. I turned to Alex and asked, "Is that your knife?" One look at him told me he was just as shocked as I was. Whoever had been there didn't seem to have good intentions. Our next move was clear: we needed to leave and fast. We jumped into the truck without packing up, but just as Alex started the engine, we realized there was another problem. The tires were flat. I got out to check, and it was obvious someone had slashed them, likely with the same knife now sticking out of our table. With no other option, we left everything behind and started running. The truck had been about a half-hour drive from the main road, which meant a long trek on foot. Adrenaline kicked in, and we kept moving without looking back. Eventually, we reached the main road, exhausted but relieved. Just then, a passing truck came into view, and Ben waved it down. We explained our situation to the driver, who graciously let us hop in the back. As we began driving away, a wave of relief washed over me. But just then, out of the corner of my eye, I caught sight of a dark figure standing by the edge of the trees. He was in a large hooded sweatshirt, obscuring his face, and he was holding a knife, the very same knife we'd found at our campsite. My buddy and I planned a camping trip, and since neither of us had any experience, we reserved an easy campsite with all the conveniences we could think of. We packed up all the necessary items and more. When we arrived, we noticed that our assigned campsite already had a tent there, but it looked ancient and appeared to have been up for weeks. It was pretty worn down. There was a fire pit, a backpack, and several other camping supplies. We went to the office to inquire about it, but they claimed they had no idea what we were referring to. We led them back to the location, but everything had vanished. All the gear was gone. It was only a 10-minute walk back to the office, so there was no way someone could have packed everything up and left without leaving a single trace. The staff suggested we must have been mistaken about our spot, but we were both confident we had gone to the same place. We tried to put it out of our minds and set up our tent, which took longer than it probably should have since, as I mentioned, we were both new to this. As night began to fall, we started to prepare a fire and brought out some marshmallows. I know it sounds cliché, but you can't go camping without roasting marshmallows. We sat around the fire chatting and enjoying a few treats before getting ready for bed once the flames died down. When we were all snuggled in, we began to hear footsteps behind us. We tried to convince ourselves it was an animal, but the steps were heavy. I figured most creatures would move quietly. We just lay there in silence, probably too frightened to budge. After a few moments, the footsteps seemed to circle around us. They then sounded like they were moving away, so we decided to peek out, and my heart sank. Right in front of us was the campsite we had seen earlier, but there was no way anyone could have set it up so quickly without us noticing. We both agreed to leave everything and run. It seemed foolish at that moment, but we hadn't even brought a phone or a flashlight. We sprinted to the office and the park ranger came with us. But when we returned, everything was gone again. The eerie campsite and ours. The ranger was just as shocked, having never witnessed anything like that before. To this day, we still have no explanation for what happened, and we both agreed we would never go camping again. I took a solo camping trip into the Appalachian Mountains, somewhere in Georgia. There was a secluded trail I had been hoping to hike, and I finally decided to go for it. It would be a 3-day trek with 2 nights out on the trail. I felt excited for the journey and the chance to escape city life for a bit. The first day went smoothly. I only saw one other hiker, and we passed each other with barely more than a nod. I soaked up the mountain scenery and enjoyed the quiet solitude. Around sunset, I found a spot to camp. It was slightly off the path in a small, open area, a well-used campsite with a tidy fire ring set up. I pitched my tent, had dinner, and then went to sleep. I never sleep through the night when I'm out camping. I tend to wake up every few hours. During one of those times, I noticed a shadow moving near my campsite. It was clearly a person. I stayed perfectly still, and after a while, they wandered off. I couldn't fall back asleep, though. My mind buzzed with questions. Who was out there, and why? The next morning, I packed up early, ate a quick breakfast, and continued down the trail, still unsettled by the night's visitor. Around midday, I noticed a man up ahead. I was about to greet him, but he disappeared into the bushes. I hesitated, worried about passing that spot. It might have been a trap. I called out, but there was no answer. Finally, I decided to keep moving. As I approached where I'd seen him, someone leapt out from behind a tree. He looked rough. His clothes were filthy, and his eyes had a wild glint. I managed to break free and ran as fast as I could. Later, I reported the attack, and a search party was dispatched, but they never found him. What haunts me the most is that another hiker later reported a similar encounter. They never caught the man, dead or alive. Even back in the safety of my regular life, a deep sense of dread stayed with me, a reminder of how close danger had been. I couldn't bring myself to go camping alone again or even return to that trail. The beauty of the mountains couldn't overshadow the fear and helplessness I had felt in that remote area. Back in the city, I kept replaying the hike in my mind, unable to forget his wild, intense stare. Researching the trail, I found other hikers with stories eerily similar to mine. Many recalled seeing a figure lurking in the shadows or hearing strange sounds in the night. Some had even reported missing items. With so many accounts, it's hard to believe they haven't caught him yet. It's as if he's there, always watching but seldom seen. My name is Sarah, and this took place last spring. I went on a camping trip to celebrate my friend Mark's birthday. We'd been planning it for a while, and all of us were looking forward to a weekend in the wilderness. Altogether, there were 5 of us, 3 guys and 2 girls. We packed up our supplies, loaded the car, and started our drive to the campsite. The view was incredible. Tall, green trees surrounded us, and the sky was a vivid blue, with the sun shining down as we set up our tents. That first night, we built a fire and made dinner. We spent the evening laughing and swapping scary stories as it got dark, unaware that a real nightmare was waiting for us. The next morning, we decided to go hiking. We picked a trail and admired the beauty around us. The sound of birds chirping, the peaceful atmosphere. We were enjoying each other's company, but when we returned to the campsite, it felt like someone had been there. My camping knife was missing, and one of my friends thought maybe I'd misplaced it. But I was pretty sure I'd left it in my bag, inside my tent. "Are you sure you didn't drop it on the hike?" Mark asked, looking worried. "I'm certain," I replied. "I checked it before we left." Even though I felt uneasy, we decided to stay another night. My friends tried to comfort me, but I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. Still, since everyone else wanted to stay, I agreed. The following morning, we woke up, and I'd almost forgotten about the strange feeling from the day before. We enjoyed another fun day of hiking and relaxing, but when we returned to our campsite that evening, Mark noticed his car's tires had been slashed. We were now stuck in the middle of nowhere with no way to get home. It would take at least 5 hours to walk to the main road, where we might be able to get a ride. There was another nearby road, though less traveled, where we thought we could try our luck. We started down that gravel path, hoping to see a passing car, but we didn't come across any. As the sun was beginning to set, I glanced back and saw someone else on the road. We couldn't make out who it was, but we felt like they were watching us. Our pace quickened, but the figure kept trailing us, and fear started to take over. "Come on, let's run," Mark said, grabbing my arm. We took off, trying to distance ourselves from the person following us. When I looked back, I saw they were holding my missing knife. We sprinted down that gravel road for a while before a car finally appeared. We stood in the middle of the road, waving our arms, and it stopped to give us a ride. Once inside, the driver asked if we needed to go back for another friend. "We don't know that person," we told him. "They were following us." It felt surreal, like something out of a novel. We didn't know who they were or why they were after us, but we all agreed on one thing: we would never go camping again. To this day, we've never talked about it again, but the image of that stranger holding my knife, following us, is a memory I can't erase.